So, this is a hard assignment that I gave you because it was too long, and I didn't tell you exactly what to read. B, did you get some of it done? Yeah. I mean, and you get a sense of like a little bit of what he's up to and what he's doing. Right, guys. So I wanted to ask a couple of questions in relationship to Augustine. So now we're moving again. We're in the 4th century. Augustine, and I gave you some wrong information last time. I said that it was Augustine, and some of you who have read this now will know this, that it was not Augustine who was the first person who was represented as reading. He sees his teacher Ambrose, who becomes one of the church fathers himself. He sees, and we'll look at that passage, he sees Ambrose sitting and reading a text silently. And it makes a huge impression on Augustine. And well, one of the things I want to talk about today is how the book functions in the Confessions. What is the role of writing, and what is the role of speech? Of course, these are good questions to ask of Augustine, because we know in his own world that he makes his living as a rhetoric teacher. What would be the equivalent of that today? An English professor? No, kinda, right? That probably is as close as you're going to come, because a rhetoric teacher would be teaching the classical texts, Greek and Latin. And through those texts, we said this about Sappho. Sappho was a lyric poet, so her stuff didn't get preserved partially because the rhetoric teachers didn't teach it. They didn't bother with it because they weren't going to teach lyric in order to teach public speaking. They would teach Homer, or in the Latin tradition, there's tons, right? Cicero among the great Roman stylists. Romans, although not comparable at all to the Greeks in their literature, do have an amazing tradition of rhetoric. So Augustine is writing, or he is working like he is in that Greek world. And I said in the assignment about Dante as well, that one of the reasons to hang on and to try to keep on focusing on the works that we're reading is that we really begin to see the payoff here. Because, and more, we'll see it much more so in Dante. Augustine, as we'll see, eventually pushes away the Greek world, right? And that's interesting, right? In his construction of himself as a Christian, he pushes away the Jewish world, the Hebraic world, and he pushes away the Greek world. And we really see the way the Catholic Church becomes an enclave, right? On the one hand, Christianity is this universal religion, but on the other, it grows up around an elite. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about this. Of course, the Catholic Church, as it developed, became a place of incredible hierarchies and power. So the democratic instincts of the universalism that we saw in Christianity, well, the church, becomes the biggest landowner in Europe, right, by far. Catholic Church, I think, is still the biggest landowner in Manhattan. So I think the church and then Columbia. So the influence of the church, and we'll talk more about this next year when we look at the Renaissance, and there's like a kind of rebellion against the church. That's the Reformation. The church itself is really constructed on hierarchies. Well, who's at the very top of the hierarchy? The Pope. Well,
the Pope.
I feel like you just gave him a Mussar, right? Yeah. Well, who is the head of the Catholic Church? The Pope. And who comes after?
Saint Paul.
So what is it? There are archbishops. No. Baseball, American baseball team. Cardinals, right. So there are cardinals. How do we know this? Because when the Pope dies, there is a college of cardinals. I'm sure, have you seen TV programs about this, right? And they all go into like a room. Every time there's a new Pope, it's like a big deal, right? They go into the Vatican. Everybody that's closed completely, they live there. And until they elect a new Pope, well, they keep on voting and voting and voting. And so that's the College of Cardinals. So they represent a very, very high ranking in the church. After that, did you see that movie? The one, no, okay, thanks. The one, with two great actors in it. I forgot, one was, oh, come on, it was very, very good. Anthony Hopkins, one of them? Right.
It's called The Right. The Right.
Oh, a guy is here. The two popes. Who's in it? Jonathan Price. I think it's Jonathan Price, right? And who else? All right. It's so interesting. It's a very, very interesting film, and the acting is unbelievable. And they're really talking. They talk a lot about the issues of, what gives authority to the Pope. I mean, of course, for the Catholic Church, it's God, but it gets very complicated. Oh, because there were two popes at the same time. Why is that a problem? Why can't there be two popes at the same time? Why were there two popes at the same time? Didn't the last usually what will happen is the Pope will die and there will be a new Pope. But the former Pope Ratzinger, I'm remembering this, he decided to retire. And he was very, very old school. And the new Pope is the current Pope, who is Francis. That's your best fun fact of the year. So he's a cool guy, right? So the Catholic doctrine, or even Catholic dogma, really develops over the ages. They have these councils. In the 4th century, they declared that God is made up of 3 aspects: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. There are other councils in the Renaissance where they add certain doctrines or dogma. In the 19th century, the Church declared that whatever the Pope says, it has to be right. The Pope is infallible. You know what that word means? You know what the word infallible means, right? Like some of your professors think they are, right? Just kidding. What do the rabbis say? If the rabbis say it's right and then it's really pointing to the left, it's the same kind of thing, right? You do what they say. I mean, it's not whatever, but infallibility is not something actually in rabbinic literature. But there is this sense. I mean, it raises all sorts of historical questions. What if one pope says one thing, he dies, and another pope says another thing, right? What wasn't that first thing infallible? And Catholic theologians will actually write about such issues. What if you have 2 popes, right? A little weird, right? So the movie is a little bit about that, because you can't really have 2 popes. In the Middle Ages, there was they broke off, and there was a papal palace in the French city of Avignon. And so that, of course, raises huge problems, right? If the Pope, because we're talking about a church which is not recognizing any branches, right? This is before the Reformation. This is it, right? You want to be Christian? This is it, right? So it's an exclusive thing. And because of the exclusivity, you can't just say, well, God authorized 2 different churches. It doesn't work like that. And he also doesn't authorize 2 different people. Anyway, so it's important to talk about that. We were talking before about today, we'll talk about Augustine and books and writing and different kinds of books and different kinds of writing. And really, Augustine is introducing a new kind of writing, I think, in his work, because he's claiming that there is something like a sacred writing. Because when he pushes off the Greeks, well, what are some of the reasons he says he doesn't like the Greeks? What's wrong with them? Are we ready for that question yet? Should we talk a little bit more about the Confessions? Let's put that question on hold for a second. All right, when we read the Confessions, it really is, as we said before, it is the first memoir, and I sometimes forget this when I'm reading it. He actually is telling his life story, right? What are the highlights of his life story? Like if we're retelling the story of Augustine in 30 seconds, what are the high points? Well, first, he's got a weird relationship with his mom. That's one, right? What else? He had very active hormones during his adolescence, right? Sometimes you see these in religious neighborhoods, you see these very religious kids, like, going like really beating their breasts, and you're like, okay. He's got hormones and a very strong guilt complex, both of which Augustine had, right? Because he's full of this kind of regret and guilt, which is interesting because it's not only negative. His guilt eventually propels him onto a new life. So he's got a lot of hormones. What's like the big event in his life? I mean, he does mention one thing and he keeps on coming back to it, which is weird. And it is the most famous scene in the Confessions. And when you go to cocktail parties and you want to show off and you genuinely have something to show off, you can talk about, of course, nobody will know what you're talking about. The scene in Confessions that everybody focuses on is where Augustine with his friends, the young Augustine, goes and steals pears from a pear orchard, from a pear tree. And he cannot let go of this event in his life. It causes him such anguish. Everything causes him anguish. And one of the, on the topic of everything causing Augustine anguish, one of the things that he really focused on that nobody had before is on time, the kind of philosophy of time. We didn't read that section. It's in book 12. It's hard to read. It's complicated. But he's also in anguish because he can't figure out what the present is, and he can't figure out what the future is, and he can't figure out what the past is, because the present is always turning into the past. So I'm simplifying what is for him just this anguishing question about the nature of time and the nature of eternity. It's really some other context. It would be very interesting to read him, and we will refer to him next year and the different conceptions of time that he has. But here, where the anguish that he feels this inner guilt, right? It's weird. Did anybody else kind of feel that he's a kind of like a little bit of a Freudian? I mean, I use Freudian obviously as a metaphor, right? Because Freud will be a while. First of all, because it will take a long time for Freud to be around, and second of all, because it's a huge anachronism, right? But I am using it as a metaphor, really, just to you see that Augustine has a sense of his psychological complexity, right? He's not only freaking out; he's thinking about his mind as he's freaking out. I really think of him. I say this every year as a kind of existential thinker. I know for some of you that term is not familiar. What does existential mean, or who is the most famous existentialist? Guy. Who is the most famous existentialist? So Jean-Paul Sartre, the French, there was like basically a French movement. It was a turn away from the history of German philosophy, especially a turn inward, a turn towards the self, and like existentialists didn't believe in God. They believed that if you want to see meaning, you must find meaning in the human. Very often they did not find meaning in the human. Sartre wrote a play called Huis Clos, which means the closed room, I think, in which you might have heard the phrase, hell is other people. That's Sartre. And then he wrote his most famous novel is Nausea, which is his feeling when he strips down all of the cultural conventions that he's in. He's stuck with his own perceptions. Sartre was like an adolescent for his whole life, right? When he's stripped of those conventions of seeing, he's just he's nauseated by the people around him. Now, of course, there's a huge difference between Augustine and a 20th century existentialist, but Augustine is focusing on the soul in ways which we have not seen before. Plato writes about the soul, Aristotle writes about the soul. But once we get back to Jerusalem, and getting back to Jerusalem means getting back to the Hebraic and to the Christian traditions, right? The Christian tradition goes back to the Hebraic tradition. And we saw the way it gets filtered in the New Testament and then into Paul. Well, then you have a soul which is demanding a kind of attention that's not the case in the earlier works that we've seen. And there is a connection, I think, and maybe we'll talk about this together now or maybe some other time. I do think there's a connection between the discovery of the infinite God as infinite, and the sense of the soul also as having into infinite potential. Now, we know in the Greek world that the gods are powerful, but they're not all powerful, right? Even Zeus sometimes one time got outsmarted, right? If you outsmart the Christian God one time, which is what Satan in Paradise Lost and Mona is trying to do with God, right? Just to outsmart him once, he's not God, right? He's not, because God cannot be like all powerful except on Tuesday at 3 o'clock, right? Can't be like that, right? So the Hebrews and the Christians together introduced the idea of the soul and the idea of the infinite. I mean, the Christians are taking the Hebrew idea of the infinite and bringing it into Christianity. And Augustine, I'm thinking this through, I know I'm repeating myself again, is when you believe in an infinite God, the possibilities of the individual are also, I don't know if they become infinite, but I think they become unlimited. When Shakespeare writes Hamlet, Hamlet describes, or somebody in the play describes the poem as a poem unlimited. Like it just doesn't, it just keeps on going. And there's something about Hamlet, and I keep on talking about it because it reproduces itself. And even when you don't know you're seeing it in different places, like we talked about this, Lion King, that's such a great example, right? It reproduces itself. Anyway, so Augustine has that sense of himself, which we haven't seen before, right? Do we get any interiority in the Odyssey, in the Iliad? You know what I mean by interiority? We're like, I mean, the ultimate interiority is Hamlet, to be or not to be, the soliloquy, right? Talking to the audience, right? Yeah. Hello? No, that was somebody. Anyway. Right. So Hamlet, the infinite, what was I saying? People? Right. So the infinity of the soul, or the opening up of the possibility of the soul, or the possibilities of the soul or of the self. I also asked you another question, and I want to ask you this now again. I told you that Augustine was part of one branch of Christianity, and he won out in the end, right? But his opponents were the Manichaeans. I don't know if I named them. They were the ones who wanted to get rid of what the Christians started to call the Old Testament, right? The Manichaeans, it's basically Star Wars, right? There's a good force and a bad force, a force of good and a force of evil. Why would anyone want to believe that? Why would a Christian, why would somebody who is in a tradition that is monotheistic, apparently, right? Why would somebody embrace this two God thing? Amanda, you know the answer to this question. Or right. Well, that's the question that's being asked, and that's answered by the Manichaeans, as you just said, right? We have a huge theological problem, right? The all-perfect God has created a world in which there's evil. How do you deal with that question? Right. I mean, everybody hears the question, right? And I'm sure if you're a religious of any variety, you probably once sat at a table where people discussed this and solved the problem that theologians and philosophers have been talking about for 2,500 years. It's, in a way, it's an insolvable problem. So the Manichaeans solve it. So they solve it, but they walk into another problem. What's the problem they walk into? If I have two forces, well, then God is not God. Right? It's just like it's like disturbing God, or tricking him, or getting one thing, tricking him once. So we're in a different world. You know, you're not in Kansas anymore, right? You're not in Athens anymore, Shahar, right? Now we're in Jerusalem. It's a big difference. It's a big difference. And although those two forces are still the forces that have really created our world, I mean, of course, it's being dismantled as we speak in many different ways, and has been for at least 100 years. But still there are those resonances of both the Greeks and the Christian tradition. So where were we again? I got sidetracked. All right, so they solve the problem, but they run into another problem, that God is not all powerful. Now, so Augustine maintains the idea that there is one God. He has to deal with the problem of evil. That's not our problem at the moment. I'm wondering, and this is the question I asked you, is there a relationship between that and Augustine's conception of the soul? Does that question even begin to make sense to any of you? Do I have to give you a little bit more? Yeah, I have to give you a little bit more. Good. Okay. So here, I mean, my assumption, and the assumption of the question, is the way I view the universe is going to determine the way I look at the soul. Oh, what's the soul? Well, I can look at the universe and see only mechanism and things and material, and then I don't believe in a soul, right? Then when I look inside, I'm a materialist. That's what Marxists were. Very depressing view of the world. Really, so many people believe in it. Right. So my assumption is that if you look at the way you understand the universe, you will also understand the way you will also understand the psyche. That there's a relationship between how one views the universe and the forces within it, and how one understands one's inner world. Getting any better? No? Want to? Yeah, getting a little better. Having a pedagogical moment here. Let's leave that as a question, and let's look at some of the text together. Okay, but we'll see. I mean, what would, as we leave the Manichaeans, and let's use them as an example. What's the version of the psyche if you believe in separate forces of good and evil? This is a thing like the way you'll answer the question is you'll think, oh, I've seen this in a movie. What is the notion of the psyche, of the soul, of the individual, right? Whatever you want to call him, her, right? What is the structure of the soul when I assume that there are separate forces of good and evil in the universe? What do you want to share that with us, or is that too personal?
I mean, honestly,
Perfect. That's exactly what I was looking for. That's you're a Manichaean. There you are, right? There are many inappropriate scenes in movies where you have the angel there, right? What the angel is saying, don't do that, and the devil is saying, do that, right? What? No? The emperor's what?
So I'm agreeing with the devil, and the angel is like, whenever I try.
But what is the emperor? Is it a movie?
Yeah.
Is this with David Tennant? Not with David Tennant and that other guy. There's a show where the people don't watch so much, where David Tennant plays the devil over many centuries. Oh, I guess you all know, right? All right, yeah.
It's called
not as good as it should. Right. It's just not. It's not. It should be really great. David Tennant is so crazy as an actor. What? He's been in a lot. He's sometimes not good because he's not in good things. Okay. Okay, good. And here's the question which we'll try to answer together. Here's the question we'll try to answer together. I'm treating you like my grandchildren right now. The question we'll try to answer together, what does it mean for Augustine when he claims that God is one, and that somehow, well, I mean, he's got to account for evil in some way. How does that change the vision of the soul that you have? Maybe we will just look at that one passage, since it is we've worked so hard to.
One person on the roof going on the one hand and on the other.
Okay. Okay, so fine. Well then, yeah. Well, that's not so simple to say either. Well, suffering tends to be unpleasant. Not if they do it, they condescend when they're doing it. You can't answer that question. Can't, you know. I mean, I think here the rabbis are right. I said this to you once before. If something good thing happens, you say atov v'meitiv. If something bad happens, you don't say, oh, it's all for the best. My field just got flooded. It's all for the best. Your friend comes over to you and says, don't worry about it. It's all for the best. What do you do to that person? I knew this very mild-mannered rabbi who said, you punch him in the face, right? Because there is, whether or not evil, I mean, you can argue that evil is on some level non-being. That's a hard thing to say. There is the perception of suffering and evil, right? And if somebody says to you, oh, I solved this for you, viscerally, you're going to say no. You might have solved that theoretically. You didn't solve it for me. That's what's very hard Philosophers may do one thing. Literary people who write literature are much more careful in not denying the experience of evil. Certainly Milton, right? That's why we like him so much, right? Okay, so there is a difference, and I'm now going to moralize for you. There's a difference between you narrating for yourself what something may mean for you, and somebody else narrating for you. Beware of people who want to narrate your lives for you. Right? They're dangerous people, and many of them are members of clergy, right? I don't know. I mean, right. I mean, that's an extreme version, right? What is gaslighting? Did you see the movie? You saw the movie, Gaslighting? No, it's a great movie.
It's very,
you should
very
watch
old.
it. You should watch it. Right. No, but people are always doing that for each other. We're always narrating other people's lives for them, either in our minds or if they're our kids or our students sometimes. I mean, hopefully not me. I mean, that's the idea we're trying not to do. The idea is that you narrate yourself. Beware of people who want to narrate your life for you. And the thing is many people like their lives being narrated for them because it's much simpler that way. But like Augustine, we have the unpleasant burden of knowing that those people will not make us happy, right? That the people who want to narrate our lives for us will not make us happy, because in a way, it's a much easier way of living in the world, right? Yeah. Does anybody remember where this is, where Augustine talks about it's not good and evil? Oh, I think I can find it. He says some person is going to have the choice. It's like the midrash on Jacob and Esau. Some people are going to want to go to the theater. What's wrong with the theater? Apparently a lot, right? Even the rabbis also, it's bad usually, right? I mean, we'll have to also talk about the way Augustine talks about play, right? And he talks about it in interesting ways. Ultimately, play and fiction and literature and rhetoric, they're all pushed out. And Christianity just becomes this exclusive thing. Let's see. So he mentions the theater lots of times. Okay, here, I found it. Look, amazing. So here we are. Oh, this is in the full text, but I'm not going to even bother to go out of it. If you want to Google it, if you want to find it in your text, it's number 23, and just put in conventicle or theater. That's how I find it, right? Conventicle. What's a conventicle? Who knows? What does it sound like? It sounds like a convent, right? It sounds like a place where people gather to be holy, right? What's that? Right, something like that, right? I wonder. Oh, you're whispering, Sherry. You're whispering. So, okay, that's not going to be it, right? It's been changed over the generations, but we know what it is, right? It's a convent, a place where religious people gather. If any man is trying to decide, let's read from the beginning, since he is putting it in this one unit. For if there are, and he's going to talk like a philosopher here, which is a little weird, right? But we're going to do our best. If there are as many opposing natures as there are opposing wills, there will be not two, but many more. What's he talking about? I mean, he's going on something he said earlier, but we're not going to go back there. I'm going to explain this to you instead. He's considering now I think he's taking the Manichaeans to task here, and he's saying, and I don't understand the argument fully, but I can go forward with this, is if you're going to say two, you should say many, right? Is that enough for us to continue together? Yeah. If any man is trying to decide whether he should go to the conventicle or to the theater, the Manichaeans at once cry out, see, here are two natures. Yitzhak haravi, Yitzhak tov. Strange in Judaism, right? Here are two natures. Sorry. One good, drawing this way, another bad, drawing back that way, our angel and our devil. For how can you explain this indecision between conflicting wills? Let's continue. But I reply, this is the part when I read this, I thought, what? But I reply that both impulses are bad. Going to the convent and going to the theater are both bad. that which draws to them and that which draws back to the theater, that which draws to them to the convent and that which draws back to the theater. But they do not believe that the will which draws to them can be anything but good. Oh, this is good. But they do not believe. What do the Manichaeans not believe? They do not believe that the will which draws to them can be anything but good. Well, sometimes I read stuff by like these Christian thinkers, and I think they're like so foreign to my sensibility, both growing up as a Reformed Jew and now being an Orthodox Jew. But some of the things they say are just so, forgive the dated metaphor, just mind-blowing to me. Or just like, they just come as like revelations. Pardon the pun. What is he saying here? But they do not believe that the will which draws to them can be anything but good. So the Manichaeans say, if you come to us, you're coming, it's all good. And what's implied? What is Augustine implying here? What is he saying? The Manichaeans say there's the good and there's the bad. And if you come to us, you're good. If you go to that side, you're bad. They're very depressing and hugely demanding psychology, right? Because you have to be all good. And it's interesting that the Christian, and this is what Augustine is doing, he's saying that the good and the evil will always be mixed. There's never just the good. That the human, coming back to the question I asked, is just like the universe. That there are not two separate forces of evil. I think in the blessing of the Shema in the Jewish liturgy, the first one says, God who makes the good and makes all things. Right? You know that? It's not who makes the good and makes bad. Rabbis are dealing with the same problem there, right? They deal with it in their own way, which we're not talking about, but you see, they avoid the dualism, right? Augustine is saying, wherever you're going, you're bringing your whole self. And because he believes this, I mean, you'll see also that he believes in the role of evil or bad or sin in repentance. I mean, there are a lot of things you read in Augustine, you think, I've seen that in Pirkei Avot, right? I think in the Tannaitic source of the rabbinic tradition, it says where a choser b'tshuva, where a bel tshuva stands, the greatest tzaddik, the greatest righteous person cannot stand, right? Whatever that means, but it's strange and counterintuitive. And Augustine says, the person who is far away from God, who becomes close, goes to his love of God. We'll have to see exactly what he says, but he's on a higher level. The person who's farther away becomes on a higher level. And they both of those perspectives, and it's in Freud as well without the ethical language, is if you use what you understand to be the bad for the purpose of good, then you become a person. Because you can't erase the past. Not the psychic past, not the historical past. The past just sits there. And sometimes that past, maybe some of you have this experience, you look back in the past and you say, oh my God, how was I that person, right? That ever happened to you? Yeah, you're about the right age for it to be happening for the first time. For me, it's like, I had to buy a big old calculator. What? Okay, you know, so Augustine, his argument is implicitly, and I'm pulling it out a little bit, I think it's a very important argument to make and see how we can learn from a person who doesn't believe necessarily the same things that we do, is that when you look on the past, or first of all, if I look at evil as a Manichaean, then it just sits there, there's nothing I can do with it. It just sits there. In Augustine's world, that experience of evil, and I know that's a hard word for us, that experience of despair, of depression, of being far away from God or being far away from the self, I think that's easier for us to understand. That experience of being far away from the self, or God in Augustine's case, that is part of who he becomes. Or because of that self, he becomes someone new. And this is why it's so important that Augustine is writing the story of his life. Because he's reclaiming his life by retelling it. And when you take Dr. Bloomberg's life writing course, right? That's what good memoir writers do. They reclaim the present through rewriting themselves, and that's what Augustine. He's writing the Confessions, and again we say another memoir. It's the first, and memoirs, and Augustine as a Christian is embracing the genre, creating the genre, and he's telling us about the skeletons in his closet. Right? They have all these books in the Orthodox Jewish world, right? You know what the word hagiography means? It's like a hagiography. If you Google it, hagiography is like treating somebody like they're a saint, right? So you have, instead of biographies, you have hagiographies. When you talk about rabbinical figures who lived whenever, and they become saints, right? It's the worst message for anybody, because it tells you that sainthood involves not being human, and sainthood is being human. So whether we're a Christian or not, that's what Augustine is saying here, that the human in all of its aspects is standing in front of God, or standing in front of the infinite. Let's finish this and we'll take a little break. Suppose then that one of us should try to decide, and through the conflict of his two wills, should waver whether he should go to the theater or to church. Would not those also waver about the answer here? Not following necessarily. We'll keep on going. For either they must confess, which they are unwilling to do, that the will that leads to our church. I don't know if I want to go here. Let's see. Okay, it gets a little bit too complicated. But again, just to end off this portion of class, and we'll take a break in a second, is there is a relationship between Augustine's departure from that world of good and evil and his conception of the soul, right? I mean, Augustine introduces the soul in conflict as something okay. It's not only something okay, the soul not in conflict is the problem. That's one of the things that every aspect of our culture is always trying to deny, or turn it into something, well, can turn into a lot of things, but certainly something that doesn't fit the pragmatic worldview that we should all have. Soul is in conflict. If it's not, life is a serious thing. Let's take a break. You can go outside and you can take your masks off. All right, people. Let's oh, right. So I just wanted to go back to one of the things that we spoke about. That we spoke about last time. Just let me write it down, and then language, and then books. Right. So we didn't really. I had asked you to look at the first 10 chapters of the first book, and there, Augustine, and we spent time talking about this a little bit, he's like struggling against his feeling of insignificance in relationship to the infinite. And he's not sure that he can even like assert himself in relationship to the divine. As we talked about last time, he feels like the divine is so encompassing that he might not even have an eye. So he's always fighting the possibility of oblivion. It's very interesting at the beginning of his life, right? He tells us about being an infant, and he says like he has really no time for something about which he has no clear memories. Very important in Augustine that so much of what he does is based upon remembering. He can't actually remember it, although he does give us some very early childhood memories, but says he's recounting this from what he's seen since that time. So like when we hear his crying baby's voice, that's also his attempt to like say, I am here. And at a certain point he despairs, and there are child psychologists who talk in the same kind of language, that his cries are no longer able to command his external environment, and how that represents a kind of crisis for him. The famous child psychologist of mid-20th century from England, D.W. Winnicott, who spends a lot of time talking about those initial moments, the experience the child has, or an infant has, when she no longer feels that attachment directly to the mother. And that's in Winnicott for children, this is a kind of crisis moment. And Augustine also identifies this as a moment when he is frustrated because his selfhood is not able to express itself. And he spends a long time talking about watching other people and learning how to speak through them. We've said, because we read the Odyssey, we know a sign when we see one. Augustine spends a long time talking about how he habituated himself to a world of signs. Meaning what it means is how I learned to speak and how through language I learned to become a self. Right. So we'll come back to that when we talk about the book. Let's look at this passage here. Look down, O Lord, our God. I know I'm not, okay, let me just have some coffee. Take a deep breath. Right. I was just thinking that Augustine it's inaccessible to those of us who find words good and evil somehow not relevant or not appropriate. But I think for Augustine, one way to think about it is the difference between flourishing and despair. Right? And in a way, in Christianity, sin is another name for despair, or despair is a part of sin. So I think that kind of translation can sometimes make it clearer, certainly not what his theology is, but what his psychology is. Look down, O Lord God, and see patiently as thou art wont to do. What is patience? What is patience?
When you put your self-interest aside, maybe?
Pardon? We can't really hear you, so I can't really relate to that. I think patience is love plus time, right? Okay, but what is it that prevents you from getting angry? Or something over time, right? Okay, right. Look down, O Lord God, and see patiently as thou art wont to do, how diligently the sons of men observe the conventional rules of letters and syllables, taught them by those who learned their letters beforehand, while they neglect the eternal rules of everlasting salvation taught by thee. What does he say? What is he talking about here? They carry it so far that if he who practices or teaches the established rules of pronunciation should speak, contrary to grammatical usage, without aspirating the first syllable of homonym, a mistake, he makes a small grammatical error. He will offend men more than if he, a human being, were to hate another human being contrary to thy commandments. It is as if he should feel that there is an enemy who could be more destructive to himself than that hatred which excites him against his fellow man, or that he could destroy him who he hates more completely than he destroys his own soul by the same hatred. Now, obviously, there is no knowledge of letters innate than the writing of conscience. Okay, so a lot packed in here. Just going back to that first sentence that we got stuck on. People care more about grammatical rules and they neglect the eternal rules of everlasting salvation. I mean, first of all, before we understand this better, what is the contrast? The conventional rules of letters and syllables. School, rhetoric, learning how to speak, learning the language of the time. And yet, I mean, and so there's a distinction between this on the one hand, and what does he call it? The eternal rules of everlasting salvation taught by thee. So what is that? What is there? Yeah, I'm listening, Michelle. Go ahead. You have to speak loud. You're wearing a mask. Yeah. Hmm. Right. I would. Yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely a resonance of that. I think here, and he quotes Paul later. In that spirit, better to live by the spirit than by the death of the letter of the law. Augustine quotes Paul there. So there, but he is positing and this is the weird part and why I'm stuck on it. There's the language that you learn in school, and that's how he makes his living. And then there's some other language, and that some other language seems to have a sacred status. I mean, it does have a sacred status. So he is proposing a sacred status to language. What does that mean? Well, what is it in opposition to in Augustine? Who are the people he really hates? I mean, who he really condemns. He just condemned the grammar teacher, right? Who cares? I mean, this could describe an academic convention, right? And it wouldn't be the rules of grammar, but some other rules of academic convention. And if you fail in that academic convention, that is going to be a cardinal sin. What other people doesn't he like? I mean, I think he says when he's growing up, he says, I got punished for playing games, right? But then I realized that my elders, the people who were punishing me, were playing more complicated versions of the same games and rewarding each other for their success. So for Augustine, language and gaming can be tied together. There are people who think language is just a game. There are people who think language, and this is what he's really getting at, is just used to manipulate others. And this, I think, is a fair question to ask everybody. Is there a possibility, and this is the question Augustine is answering, is there a possibility of a non-manipulative language? Right? We all have very well-developed, we learned this word last time, hermeneutics of suspicion. Hermeneutic, again, is interpretation. I'll give you a more colloquial translation of the hermeneutics of suspicion. The hermeneutics of suspicion is a bullshit detector, right? All right, and we're always on the look for it, right? Always. That is, I mean, you know, it's outside the classroom, that's my default, really. Outside my classroom and sometimes at my dining room table with my family, right? Mostly there. That's the default, it's just suspicion. Because you're always afraid that somebody is using language to play you. It's interesting, there's another metaphor that comes in Hamlet. Hamlet says to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, you will not play me, I will not be played. And Hamlet, that play, is all about just this question we're asking. Is there a language outside of it? So isn't there somebody who is madly in love? No, nobody? What's that? I'm not saying words. I'm talking about not specific words, but a rhetoric. Okay, give me a context. I share your idealism, but I want to go down like the philosophers in the 17th century. They take everything away. I want to take everything away and not assume anything. Good, I don't want to assume anything. I think the rabbis are like this in the Talmud. They never assume that somebody's going to be generous. They always assume that somebody's acting out. When they give cases, it's not like, oh, this guy's a really nice guy and he's going to give in. It's like, this guy is the most manipulative person in the world and he's going to use everything that he can in order to make his case, right? And that's why the halakha is interesting, because it does deal with those, it deals with the human. So I would think, I'm trying to find out, where is there a context in which there actually is a language that is not based on manipulation. And I'm glad what you said, Danny. This is a context when that's hopefully happening, right? The classroom is the ideal context in which that should be happening, right? Where there is this belief, which is, I think, always has to be remembered. We believe that revelation is possible, not necessarily on Mount Sinai, but that one person can say something to another and it will change the way she thinks, or she can say something and it will change the way that I think. That's a huge assumption. And in order to make that assumption, you have to presuppose, another way of saying assume, you have to presuppose a whole bunch of different things like goodness or love, or, I mean, the whole idea of communicability, that we can communicate with each other, is not so simple. I mean, what 17th century philosophers will say in the end is, we agree that things mean certain things, and we somehow, everything is commerce, everything is materiality. So there are philosophers like that in the 17th century who say, no, there's nothing. There's nothing beyond the material. And Augustine is claiming, and I think this is like one of the reasons he's so important, that there is a sacred space where language signifies and is not for manipulation. It is for revelation and for redemption. We don't agree, I mean, I don't agree with his idea of what redemption is, right? But I understand what he means when he's speaking about the realm of language, which I think is poetry, is that, and for him, Christianity is a form of poetry, that there's a realm of language that is meant to elevate and not to manipulate.
Why can't
I didn't say that it couldn't be. I didn't say it couldn't be. But the concept of revelation as non-manipulative exists for Augustine, and he holds this as a model in teaching as well. Really, I mean, I'm actually saying I hold this as a model in teaching, that we, in the process of talking to each other, can reveal things to each other. It's education. It's education, right? Oh, well, so we're not going in that direction. So that's the assumption that Augustine has, right? You're really taking the sophist position and saying we're going to no, but everybody's in the cave. It's another way of, right? Augustine is escaping the cave, and in escaping the cave, he just pushes the Greek tradition away. Right? We can argue about. You're right. I turned this into something. Augustine is very personal for me, so I did turn this into something personal. But we're not evaluating the truth claims that he's claiming. We're going along with him and following those truth claims, seeing what comes out of it, right? We're not, when we read Aristotle or we read Milton or Shakespeare, we're not saying, oh, you're my Rebbe, right? When I wrote a book on Mary Astell, the 18th century proto-feminist, who's a fascinating proto-feminist for her age, but also a right-wing politician, I didn't say, oh, I can't write this book about her because her politics are so different than mine, right? I mean, part of her politics are, because you can learn from people who are different from you, right? Anyway, so let's see how, again, let's continue a little bit more and see how Augustine refers to, let's look at one more passage. So we're going to go to multitudes in the monasteries. Multitudes. Here we go. Let me make sure we get to the part that I want to. So here, let's start on 15. So he's talking about when his friends, from this, his conversation turned to the multitudes in the monasteries and their manners so fragrant to thee, and to the teeming solitudes of the wilderness, of which we know nothing at all. There was even a monastery at Milan, outside the city walls, full of good brothers under the fostering care of Ambrose. That's the guy who reads, right? And we didn't know about it. He went on with his story. This visitor is telling a story, and we listened intently and in silence. He then told us how on a certain afternoon at Trier, this place, I guess, when the emperor was occupied watching the gladiatorial games, so it's an interesting detail, that's the emperor, empire, and Augustine is saying, he wrote another book called The City of God. There's the City of God and the City of Man. And he's just categorized the City of Man, Augustus, as a place of gaming, right? And that's how, of games. He's dismissing it in that way. Gladiatorial games. He and 3 comrades went out for a walk in the gardens close to the city. There, as they chanced to walk 2 by 2, one strolled away with him, while the other 2 went by themselves. We're getting a lot of details here. As they rambled, these first 2 came upon a cottage where lived some of thy servants, some of them poor in spirit. So we're in a monastery now, right? Where they found the book in which was written the life of Anthony. Anthony's this Egyptian guy who was Choser B'Tshuva, who turned to God. One of them began to read it, to marvel and to be inflamed by it. While reading, he meditated on embracing just such a life, giving up his worldly employment to seek thee alone. So how is Augustine representing reading here? I mean, reading, so it's interesting that a guy comes and tells a story to them. And Augustine, like we said of the Gospels, it's a literary text. A guy comes and tells a story. What's happening in the story? The guy reads a book. And in the story, the guy who reads the book, what happens to him? His whole life is transformed. So Augustine is a humanist. In a way, I mean, he's pushing away the Greek tradition. But why do I call him a humanist? Somebody who embraces the human. And there's a really Renaissance figures, which we'll find out more about next year, because the book is what transforms you. When you read a book, you get transformed. And here he describes himself in the end. We'll just look at chapter 12 at the very end of this. Let's see. I was saying these things. Here. I was saying these things and weeping in the most bitter contrition. What does contrition mean? What does it mean to be contrite? I feel contrite about what I just said. I feel regretful, right? I was saying these things and weeping in the most bitter contrition of my heart when suddenly I heard the voice of a boy or a girl, I know not which, coming from the neighboring house, chanting over and over again, pick it up, read it, pick it up, read it. Why do you think there's the indeterminacy about whether it's a boy or a girl? What? In Milton's Paradise Lost, angels eat and have sex, but I don't think they're gendered. So it's not a boy or a girl because there's a suggestion here that it's an angel, I think, right? Because angels don't, what's that? Immediately, so, and what is the voice? I mean, I feel like we could hear, this should be the voice that they have it in the library or at Barnes and Nobles, right? Pick it up, read it, pick it up, read it. I mean, let's hear what this angel is saying. He's our angel. He's saying, read books, pick it up, read it. Immediately I ceased weeping and began most earnestly to think whether it was usual for children in some kind of game to sing such a song. So Augustine, he's ready because he's still of that Greek mindset to reject this as a game. It must be some kind of game, right? It's not real. It's really at the end, and this is like we're already past his adolescent crises of desire, and he goes to prostitutes and can't control himself and beats himself up over it. So we're getting to the very end of that. We missed out on a lot of that. And here at this moment, he hears this angelic voice and he still thinks it might be a game. But I could not remember having heard the like. So damning the torrent of my fears, I got to my feet, for I could not but think that this was a divine command to open the Bible and read the first passage I should light upon. I guess that was a thing for early Christians, right? Is anybody in their own tradition like open the Bible and point to a pasuk or a verse? Nobody does that, right? What? No, so this is like, no, so no, you open up the book and that it's like, right, that's me. It's like it seems like a form of fortune telling, right? It seems like that's what it is here. What's that? I'm sure there are a lot of people who do a lot of crazy things. Yeah, those people, yeah.
So they had this tradition that if they will dedicate something and they come like to have like an answer from the Bible, they
They will go to a random Jewish kid and tell him.
It's a one story. Okay, it's one story. It's one story. Okay, so it is a rabbi story, and you'd have to read whatever. Although you have to read there. You know what? The rabbis also are poets, and it means. And there's this book called The Little Midrash Says. I don't know if you grew up with that, right? The Midrash, as we talked about, is this rabbinic tradition of stories as interpretation, and in some Jewish homes they have this Little Midrash Says, which turns them into very cute stories, right? Most people never grow out of the Little Midrash Says, right? They never advance beyond that version, and that can be used as a metaphor in life as well. Everybody, we like to stay with the simplest reading. So I'm saying that well, no. So the idea, and this is kind of the idea. Well, we'll talk about Plato some other time. Let's read it from here. So damning the torrent of my tears, I got to my feet, for I could not but think that this was a divine command to open the Bible and read the first passage I should light upon. For I had heard how Anthony, right, that's the guy we had just heard about, somebody had told a story about this story. So interestingly, the way in which this whole idea of Christianity is spreading is through books and reading, which is very different from the Gospels. How was the good news spread in the Gospels? Preaching, right? Lots of preaching. And here Augustine is saying it's not only going to be through preaching, it's going to be through reading. I think it's really interesting that he gets this, he understands the book in front of him, or the Bible in front of him, in such a way because he's heard about the story of Anthony in a book. So this whole culture of books. Let's read a little bit more. For I had heard how Anthony accidentally coming into church while the gospel was being read, received the admonition as if what was read had been addressed to him. You go into your place of worship, whoever is leading the services at a certain moment says this particular thing, and you think, oh, I came in at just the right moment. That was directed at me. Go and sell what you have and give it to the poor, and you shall have treasure in heaven. And that's, I guess, what Anthony did. By such an oracle, he was forthwith converted to thee. So I quickly returned to the bench. Let's see how long this is. So I quickly returned to the bench where Alpius was sitting. And let's read it. I snatched it up, opened it, and in silence, that he saw his teacher Ambrose reading in silence. And we said last time, and this is what you're saying as well now, Muna, that in silence, there is that moment of interiority and individuality. Meaning when I'm reading and publicly declaiming something, there's a public aspect to it. This reading in silence is also affirming Augustine's nature of the soul. It's yours. It really is yours, as you were saying, yeah? Let's get the bottom two lines up. I wanted to read further, I wanted to read no further, nor did I need to, for instantly as the sentence ended, there was infused in my heart something like the full light of certainty. Wow, do you believe that? I mean, you know why I believe this? Because there are 6 books before it, right? If this is in book 1, it's like, give me a break, right? But in book 6, and this is a key if you ever do any memoir writing, right? If you want to get someplace, you have to earn getting there. So Augustine may have earned getting there. I mean, we haven't had the whole process of reading everything up until now. Closing the book then, and putting my finger or something else for a mark, I began, now with a tranquil countenance, he's chilled, right? To tell it all to Alpius. And he in turn to close to me what had been going on in himself, right? It's like this revelation of books. He asked to see what I had read. I showed him. And he looked on even further than I had read. I had not known what followed, but indeed it was this, him that is weak in the faith receive. This he applied to himself. There's a lot going on here, right? You see this now, we're not only have reading, we have a community of readers, and they help each other. Communities of readers help each other. That's an interesting idea as well, right? This he applied to himself and told me so. So it's through their reading together that his friend also transforms. So he gets strengthened. Then we went into my mother. I love this part, right? Then we went into my mother. Sorry, I'll do my best. Then we went to my mother and told her what had happened. To her great joy, we had explained to her how it had occurred, and she leapt for triumphant joy. And she blessed thee who art able to do exceedingly abundant above all what we seek or think. For she saw thou had granted her far more than she had ever asked for in all her pitiful and doleful lamentations. Oh, and then she goes on, I like the last line, and so thou didst turn her grief into gladness, more plentiful Then she had ventured desire, and dearer and purer than the desire she used to cherish of having grandchildren by flesh. This is where Augustine is not Jewish, right? Where are the grandkids, right? I just missed a line here, which I wanted to pick up, which is important just about books here. Sorry. Because let's just read the last sentence of the previous paragraph. By these words of warning, he was strengthened, and by exercising his good resolution and purpose, all very much in keeping with his character, in which in these respects he was always far different from and better than I. He joined me in full commitment without any restless hesitation. So you see Augustine's poetry here, and what I just mean here is the way he uses language here, or the way he tells the story. In the end, was his friend Alpius far better than him? That's not really the point, one way or the other. It's that he's different, and that there's a different verse that speaks to him, and that reading, and this is what Amunah said, is a individual experience, and everybody. I mean, it's obviously a very small community here, but Augustine is modeling a community of readers. And that's, I mean, and as he continues to write the Confessions, the book becomes the means to build that community of readers. He says at a certain point, why am I writing this? God doesn't need this. I'm writing this so other people can know the depth of my soul. Not just because he's an exhibitionist, but because he wants other people to recognize the depths of their souls. I feel like I'm a Protestant preacher today. But you see how cool Augustine is, right? I mean, I'm pulling out, I mean, everything that I described today is so crucial to the literary story that we're telling, especially as we go into the Renaissance, about the nature of the modern individual. Because when people go back, like Milton and Shakespeare, when they go back to the Greeks, obviously go back to the Gospels, to Paul, and to Augustine plays such a huge role in the way they think. And because they play such a huge role in the way they think, they play a huge role in the way we think, well, you know, we just don't know where it comes from. Okay, so I'll see you guys on Wednesday. I'm sorry it's going to be, I think on Wednesday what we will do is talk at length about what I will expect from you for the take-home exam. Okay, and maybe what we'll do, we'll spend like the whole class on it, and we'll talk about how to take exams. Do your instructors talk about how to take exams? Yeah. Oh, they're gonna, no, I'm not. I'm just talking about how the strategies for yourself of taking exams. I'm sure if you went to a good high school, you probably have this, right? And good high schools tend to teach that. If you, a good high school, somebody teach a good high school is well, you know.